Every Game of Thrones fan knows that there are some questions raised in the show that we never got answers to. George R.R. Martin built Westeros with so much depth that the show itself could only ever skim the surface. And for years, fans were left filling in the blanks with theories, wiki deep dives, and a healthy amount of speculation. Then House of the Dragon arrived, and suddenly a lot of those gaps started closing on their own. What makes this prequel so satisfying isn't just that it's a good story in its own right, although it absolutely is. It's that nearly every episode seems to reach back into Game of Thrones and answer something we'd quietly wondered about for years. House of the Dragon, and the source material it pulls from in Fire and Blood, takes Westerosi history that was previously just background noise and turns it into flesh and blood drama, dragons and all. So today, we're counting down 20 questions that Game of Thrones left dangling, and showing exactly how House of the Dragon answered them. Coming in at number 20, can dragons actually drown or be hurt by ordinary hazards beyond fire? Game of Thrones treated dragons as nearly invincible, with the only real threats being Valyrian steel, dragonbinder horns, and ice spears wielded by the dead. Smaller, more mundane dangers never really came up because Daenerys' three dragons spent most of their time on screen as the biggest, most dominant creatures around. House of the Dragon flips that assumption by showing just how vulnerable young or unbonded dragons can be. We see dragons injured by chains and weakened through neglect. Dragons aren't gods, they're just animals with wings and fire in their bellies, and House of the Dragon never lets you forget that nature still applies to them, even when magic is involved. Next up at number 19, do people in the South still worship the old gods, or did the faith of the Seven wipe that out completely? When the Andals crossed the Narrow Sea and settled Westeros, they brought the faith of the Seven with them, and over time, the old religion of the First Men got pushed further and further north, until it became almost exclusively a northern thing. But Game of Thrones drops a few clues that the picture isn't quite that clean. House of the Dragon picks up on this and makes it explicit through House Blackwood, who still follow the old gods well south of the Neck, their sigil carrying a weirwood tree as a permanent reminder of where their loyalties lie. It's part of why the Blackwoods and the Brackens, their rival house, have despised each other for generations, since the Brackens embraced the faith of the Seven and saw their neighbors' continued worship as backward. At number 18, did the Seven Kingdoms ever fight wars against outside enemies, or was it just centuries of Westerosi infighting? Both Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon are obsessed with civil war, to the point where you'd be forgiven for thinking that Westeros never had to deal with a single outside threat that wasn't undead. House of the Dragon corrects that by giving us the Stepstones conflict, a prolonged and brutal struggle between House Valyrian and the Triarchy, an alliance formed by three of the free cities across the Narrow Sea. The Stepstones themselves are a chain of islands that once connected Westeros to Essos, and they've been a magnet for piracy and territorial disputes for as long as anyone can remember. Corlys Velaryon, the Sea Snake, builds his entire reputation on clearing those waters of the Triarchy's grip, and that conflict doesn't just disappear once the opening arc wraps up. The Triarchy resurfaces later during the Dance of the Dragons itself, and when the Greens reach out to them for naval support to break the Blacks' blockade of King's Landing. It's a great example of how Westerosi politics never exists in a vacuum. Up next, at number 17, how exactly do dragons fight each other? This is one we know a lot of fans were curious about because Game of Thrones simply never gave us a chance to see it properly. With only 3 adult dragons in the entire show, and only one of them ever facing aerial combat against an equal, dragon versus dragon warfare stayed mostly theoretical. House of the Dragon throws that theory out the window the moment the Dance of the Dragons kicks into gear. What we learn is that dragon combat isn't some elegant aerial dance. It's vicious, chaotic, and deeply physical. Larger dragons tend to grapple, locking claws and twisting through the air while trying to get their jaws around a wing or a neck. Smaller, more agile dragons sometimes try to use their speed to dodge and strike from angles a bigger beast can't easily defend. Fire gets used too, but it's often secondary to the raw physical struggle. The biting and tearing that makes these fights look less like a fencing match and more like two predators trying to kill each other in midair. Number 16, are all Targaryens fireproof? We know this got addressed back in the original series. Daenerys walks out of Khal Drogo's funeral pyre without a single burn, and the show treats that as a confirmation that fire simply doesn't work on her. The problem is that some fans extended that logic to the entire Targaryen bloodline, assuming that anyone with silver hair and purple eyes must share the same immunity. House of the Dragon makes it abundantly clear that that isn't how it works. Viserys got burned on screen. More dramatically, during the Battle of Rook's Rest, Vhagar's fire breath cooks Aegon Aegon inside his own armor, leaving him with severe injuries. If that scene doesn't convince people that Targaryens are heat-resistant rather than fireproof, nothing will. Whatever protection their blood offers, and there clearly is some protection given how they survive things that would kill an ordinary person, it has limits. At number 15, who actually takes care of dragons when nobody's riding them? In Game of Thrones, Daenerys handles her 3 dragons more or less personally. She feeds them, she scolds them, she locks 2 of them in the catacombs beneath Meereen when things get out of hand. It paints a picture where dragon care is mostly improvised, something a Targaryen figures out as they go. House of the Dragon introduces an entire institution built around this exact problem: the Dragon Keepers. These are specialized caretakers, fluent in High Valyrian, trained from a young age to manage the practical side of raising and maintaining dragons. They help with feeding schedules, they assist during the delicate process of egg incubation, and they're present when young dragons are first introduced to potential riders. It's a job that requires equal parts bravery and patience, since these are still wild animals capable of killing a person without even meaning to. Number 14, why does the Night's Watch feel so pathetic by the time Jon Snow shows up? We're talking about an organization that's supposed to be the last line of defense against everything north of the Wall. Yet by the time Game of Thrones starts, it's staffed by criminals, debtors, and desperate men who joined because the alternative was worse. It feels like an institution in terminal decline, rather than the proud order it's described as in old stories. House of the Dragon gives us context for exactly how that decline happened through Cregan Stark, the Lord of Winterfell, who explains the history directly. For thousands of years, the Watch was largely filled with men sentenced there as punishment, which is part of why its reputation suffered. But Cregan's ancestor, Torrhen, the last king in the north before bending the knee to Aegon the Conqueror, established a new tradition where each winter, a tenth of his own men would be sent to serve at the Wall voluntarily, treating it as an honorable duty rather than a sentence. For a while, that policy helped keep the Watch staffed with capable men rather than just criminals. But Aegon's conquest brought an extended period of relative peace to Westeros, and peace meant fewer criminals being sentenced to the Wall and fewer reasons for lords to keep sending their own men north. Over the generations, that pipeline of volunteers dried up, and the Watch slowly reverted to relying on whoever the realm didn't want anymore. Coming in at number 13, why didn't the Targaryens ever use their dragons to explore north of the Wall? Given how far dragons can fly and how much ground they can cover, it always felt strange that nobody in 300 years of Targaryen rule thought to send one beyond the Wall just to see what was out there. Cregan Stark addresses this directly when he recounts a visit from King Jaehaerys I and Queen Alysanne, 2 of the most beloved rulers in Targaryen history, who toured the realm together on dragonback. When they reached the Wall, their dragons simply refused to cross it. No amount of coaxing could get them to fly beyond that barrier, which is a remarkable detail when you consider just how fearless dragons are in literally every other context we see them in. It lines up disturbingly well with what we eventually see in Game of Thrones, when Daenerys' dragons engage the army of the dead beyond the Wall for the first time, and one of them, Viserion, ends up killed and reanimated by the Night King himself. Whatever ancient magic or memory makes dragons hesitate at that boundary, it turns out their instincts were dead right to be afraid. Number 12, can a dragon whose rider has died ever be ridden by someone new? This became a hot topic among fans, especially after the finale, when people wondered whether Drogon might eventually accept a different rider now that Daenerys was gone. House of the Dragon answers this pretty conclusively by showing that bonding with a riderless dragon, while difficult and dangerous, absolutely happens, and with some regularity, given how long dragons tend to outlive humans who ride them. The clearest example is Vhagar, the oldest and largest living dragon during the show's timeline, who has had 4 different riders across her long life, starting with Visenya Targaryen herself, and eventually ending up under Aemon's control after a tense standoff with his own cousin. The process isn't simple. Some dragons take to a new rider quickly, while others resist for years or never accept anyone again. Personally, it plays a massive role, both the dragons and the prospective riders, and there's a sense that the older, more experienced dragons like Vhagar have simply seen enough humans come and go that the bonding process becomes almost transactional rather than emotional. At number 11, where did Daenerys' 3 dragon eggs actually come from? This is one that bothered a lot of book readers and show watchers alike, since by the time Daenerys receives her eggs as a wedding gift from Illyrio Mopatis, dragons have become extinct for well over a century. The implication was always that these were simply old fossilized eggs that mysteriously hatched thanks to Daenerys' blood magic and the funeral pyre, but the actual origin of the eggs themselves stayed a mystery. House of the Dragon closes that gap beautifully. The 3 eggs are revealed to have been laid by Syrax, Rhaenyra's own dragon, making them direct, traceable products of the Targaryen Civil War era rather than some ancient, untraceable relic. Daemon collects them from the dragon pit, and they remain part of the family's holdings for years. Once the Dance of the Dragons turns disastrous, and Rhaenyra needs to protect her bloodline's future, she sends the eggs away along with her 2 youngest children, routing them first through the Vale of Arryn before their ultimate destination becomes Pentos, the very city where Illyrio Mopatis operates generations later. Coming in at number 10, were the Targaryens really the only Valyrian house clever enough to escape the Doom? Game of Thrones references the Doom of Valyria more than once, usually in hushed, reverent tones, as if House Targaryen alone had the foresight to flee a catastrophe that wiped out an entire civilization, along with most of its dragons. It's an easy assumption to make, since the show never gives us another Valyrian bloodline of any real significance. House of the Dragon corrects that picture by introducing House Valyrian front and center, a family every bit as old and as Valyrian as the Targaryens, and one that actually settled in Westeros before Aegon's ancestors did. Corlys Valyrian, the Sea Snake, takes enormous pride in this history, and it shapes how he carries himself throughout the entire series, always slightly resentful that the Targaryens get to wear the crown, while his own family helped build Westeros' maritime power from the ground up. The Valyrians do exist in George R.R. Martin's novels, but they play a fairly minor role there, mostly known as a house loyal to Stannis Baratheon, so the original show simply didn't have a reason to feature them. House of the Dragon gives them their due, and in doing so quietly reshapes how we think about Valyria's fall. At number 9, why did Aegon actually conquer Westeros in the first place? Westerosi history, as it's told within the show itself, frames Aegon's conquest as a simple ambition. He wanted the 7 kingdoms united under his rule, so he took them, with his sisters and his dragons doing most of the heavy lifting. It's the kind of answer that satisfies a textbook but never quite explains why a man with everything he could want on Dragonstone would bother conquering an entire continent. House of the Dragon gives us something far more interesting. Aegon experienced a vision, a dream of the White Walkers returning and the Long Night descending on Westeros once again, and that vision convinced him that the realm needed to be unified under Targaryen rule before that day arrived, so that whoever sat on the Iron Throne when the cold finally came would have the strength and the dragons necessary to fight it off. This becomes the Song of Ice and Fire, the prophecy that Aegon passes down to his heir, who passes it down to theirs, all the way through the family line. It's a small twist that completely reframes the conquest. At number 8, why did Rhaenyra Targaryen believe she had a legitimate claim to a throne that in living memory no woman had ever sat on? She gets mentioned a couple times in the original series, most notably when Joffrey gives Margaery an unsettling little history lesson about the Dance of the Dragons back in Season 3, and again when Shireen Baratheon brings it up in passing during Season 5. Both moments treat Rhaenyra's story as a cautionary tale about the Targaryen Civil War, but neither gives us any sense of who she actually was as a person, or why her claim mattered in the first place. House of the Dragon spends its entire run answering exactly that. We watch Rhaenyra get named heir by her own father, watch her navigate a court that constantly undermines her right to rule simply because of her gender, and watch the political machinery work against her even as Viserys does everything in his power to protect her position. By the time the dance actually arrives, you understand precisely why Rhaenyra believed the throne was hers, not because she was hungry for power like so many other claimants in this universe, but because her own father named her his heir. At number 7, have other Targaryens experienced prophetic visions the way Daenerys does in the House of the Undying? Daenerys' visions in Qarth always felt like an isolated bit of magic, something tied specifically to her storyline, and the witch Mirri Maz Duur's curse rather than a broader Targaryen trait. House of the Dragon reveals that dragon dreams, as they're called, run much deeper in the family than that single moment suggests. Daenys Targaryen, sometimes called Daenys the Dreamer, foresaw the doom of Valyria years before it happened, which is the entire reason her family relocated to Dragonstone in time to survive it. Aegon the Conqueror's vision of returning White Walkers, which we just covered, falls into this same category. Viserys I had his own dreams, seeing his son crowned amid clashing swords and roaring dragons, a vision that technically comes true, just not remotely in the way he expected or hoped. His daughter Helaena shows flashes of the same gift through the show, often delivering cryptic, unsettling lines that only make sense in hindsight. Even Daemon experiences visions during his fevered time at Harrenhal, glimpsing both past and future events with a clarity that unsettles even him. Taken together, these moments reveal that prophecy isn't some rare anomaly limited to Daenerys alone. Coming in at number 6, exactly how many dragons did House Targaryen have at the absolute height of their power? 3 dragons felt like an overwhelming force in Game of Thrones, especially once Daenerys started using them to topple slave cities and burn down armies. It's easy to forget that 3 dragons are actually a tiny fraction of what the family once commanded. House of the Dragon gives us the exact numbers, mostly through Daemon, who lays it all out plainly. Before the war truly ignites, the family's dragons include Syrax, Caraxes, and Melis among the senior generation, while the younger Targaryen children claim Vermax, Arax, and Tyraxes, with Baela claiming Moondancer. Beyond these named, bonded dragons, the Blacks hold roughly 13 dragons total at the start of the conflict, including several riderless ones still waiting to be claimed, while the Greens control only 4. On top of all that, there are still around 20 dragon eggs incubating on Dragonstone at the time, any of which could theoretically hatch given the right circumstances. It's a staggering number when you compare it to the lonely 3 dragons Daenerys commanded 2 centuries later, and it makes the eventual outcome of the dance feel even more tragic. At number 5, what actually happened in the gap between the doom of Valyria and Aegon's conquest of Westeros? Game of Thrones references both events individually, but the century or so separating them was always a complete blank. House of the Dragon, drawing directly from Fire and Blood, fills that gap with the Century of Blood. A brutal, chaotic period where Valyria's former colonies tore each other apart, trying to claim the dead empire's legacy. Volantis emerges as the most aggressive of these former colonies, attempting to position itself as the rightful successor to Valyrian power and dominance across Essos. Before Aegon ever turned his attention toward Westeros, he flew Balerion the Black Dread across the Narrow Sea to intervene directly in this conflict, helping turn the tide against Volantis during a critical naval engagement near Lys, burning an entire enemy fleet in the process. Moving on to number 4, did Targaryens genuinely control their dragons, or was that bond always something looser and more fragile than the show implied? Daenerys' relationship with her dragons reinforced the idea of natural mastery, the assumption that being born a Targaryen meant dragons would simply obey. House of the Dragon dismantles that assumption almost immediately. Viserys himself voices doubt about it, suggesting that Targaryen control over dragons has always been something closer to an illusion the family maintains, rather than an actual guaranteed bond. That doubt gets violently confirmed during the Season 1 finale, when neither Lucerys nor Aemon can fully control their dragons during their disastrous confrontation in the sky above Storm's End, a moment of fear and instinct overriding whatever command either boy thought he had. Dragons respond to emotion, to fear, to aggression, sometimes acting entirely on their own impulses regardless of what their rider wants. Some bonds run deeper than others. Daemon's connection with Caraxes feels almost telepathic at points, built over decades of shared battles and mutual trust. But that kind of bond is the exception, not the baseline, and House of the Dragon makes it clear that riding a dragon has always been more of a negotiation than a command structure, no matter how the Targaryens like to present it to the rest of Westeros. At number 3, what was the real history behind the Valyrian steel dagger that ends up killing the Night King? This one matters because that dagger plays an enormous role in the climax of Game of Thrones, yet it arrives in the story with almost no context. We know it gets used in an assassination attempt against Bran Stark, and we know Arya eventually uses it to end the war against the dead, but its origins before that moment stay frustratingly vague. House of the Dragon and Fire and Blood trace its lineage all the way back to Aenar Targaryen, the Dragon Lord who fled Valyria with his family before the doom even occurred. The dagger eventually passes to Aegon the Conqueror, who has it inscribed with a hidden message, one that only becomes visible when exposed to fire, carrying the same prophecy his family would pass down for generations. From Aegon onward, the dagger becomes a kind of physical vessel for the Song of Ice and Fire prophecy itself, handed from Targaryen heir to Targaryen heir, as both a weapon and a symbol. Eventually it leaves the family's possession entirely, ending up, fittingly and ominously, as the very blade used to try to kill a Stark, before becoming the weapon that ends the war the prophecy always warned about. At number 2, what actually started the Targaryen civil war that Game of Thrones refers to as the Dance of the Dragons? We always knew broadly that it was a war of succession between Rhaenyra and her younger half-brother Aegon II, and we always knew Viserys wouldn't survive long enough to see how it played out. But the deeper mechanics of how that conflict actually ignited stayed mostly theoretical until House of the Dragon walked us through it step by step. Rhaenyra spends years as her father's named and sworn heir, with the realm's most powerful lords pledging loyalty to her claim directly. The fracture begins with a series of misunderstandings and broken trust between Viserys and Alicent, compounded by years of resentment, manipulation from Otto Hightower, and a court increasingly divided along factional lines long before Viserys actually dies. Even after the Greens stage their coup and crown Aegon in the immediate aftermath of Viserys' death, Rhaenyra initially tries to avoid outright war, hoping to find some path that doesn't end in mass bloodshed. It's the death of her young son Lucerys at Aemon's hands, whether intentional or not, that finally removes any possibility of restraint on either side. And finally, at number 1, just how seriously should we take the prophecy of the prince that was promised, the one that Melisandre spends so much of Game of Thrones preaching about? For a long stretch of the original series, the prophecy feels like it might just be religion religious dogma, something Melisandre genuinely believes but that the show never fully confirms as objectively true. House of the Dragon gives it far more weight than anyone expected. We learn that Aegon the Conqueror experienced his own version of this exact vision, seeing the Long Night returning and understanding that a Targaryen would need to sit on the throne when the day came in order to unite the realm against it. That vision becomes the Song of Ice and Fire, passed down through the family for generations, eventually finding its way to Daenerys the Dreamer's foresight, and resurfacing again in Viserys' own dreams about his successor. Meanwhile, completely independent of the Targaryen line, the Red Priests of Essos preach a strikingly similar prophecy about a promised hero born to fight back the darkness, which is exactly the doctrine Melisandre carries with her into Stannis Baratheon's camp centuries later. The fact that these two traditions arrive at essentially the same prophecy independently suggests something real is actually happening here, some genuine thread of foresight running beneath the surface of Westerosi history rather than just convenient mythology. Make sure to check out our next video on all 17 dragons in House of the Dragon, ranked from weakest to strongest.